So, I mean, the whole idea came from this like lockdown. I never thought that I would do some podcast. It just like suddenly I thought, no, it's part of my managing mental health as well because
Mm.
it gives you some kind of distraction from the things we are going through. Dr. Matt Graham, my colleague, my friend, um, so he's with me today, and we'll talk lots of things, especially on South Africa, his research, his teaching, his uh, political activism a bit, if he has, his. I think he have got serious interest in football as well. So touch a bit there. He's ever smiling man. we always have good funs in the pubs, but things are tough now, so cannot go back. I think one of my best memories with you is like we actually watched World Cup football in a pub, in a local Dundee pub.
I think that would have probably been around about. It might be my first year in Dundee in 2012.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I still remember, like, I think, was it Iran playing with some big team and then Iran was playing really, really good?
Honestly, I can't remember. I can't remember the game. The game has faded into history, but I remember the experience of being there with you.
Because of my politics. I mean, I always support the underdog,
The best way to be.
Yeah, always take side with the oppressed.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, like, yeah, that obligatory question, like, I mean, tell us about where you're born, raised, any of those earliest memories.
So I was born in Birmingham. So I'm a Brummie. And I mean that's where I grew up and went to school. And so kind of being a Brummie like is actually part of my identity and quite an important part of who I am. And it's a very particular kind of region of the UK with its own kind of ways of thinking and actions, and it's also a place where a lot of the rest of the UK looks down on as well. So I have a certain pride for my hometown, and so yeah, I mean, so I lived in Birmingham until I was 18 before I went off to university in Sheffield. And in kind of terms of like earliest memories, I mean, actually, it's probably doing things connected to history. I mean, so I was always interested in kind of castles and those kind of things, and there's lots of them around the West Midlands, places like Kenilworth and Warwick. So I spent, a lot of my childhood running around castle ruins, and that was kind of a big draw into kind of the subject and in terms of the ways, maybe things I wanted to do in the future as well around, around historical topics. So yeah, I mean those are kind of some of the key things that I, really enjoyed doing. So yeah, so I'm basically from Birmingham, and kind of history actually was a big part of me as a kid.
I mean, like one pertinent question can be like, I mean, looking back, how do you think your parents or anyone like from the schools or any other, people more or less shaped your understanding or about this
I
thing?
mean, oh, absolutely. So I mean, in terms of, I mean, my parents, I mean, they're obviously incredibly supportive. They're both teachers, so the centrality of education was a key part of my upbringing. So huge amounts of reading and also going to particular kind of museums and sites and that kind of stuff. So very privileged to have had those opportunities in terms of um, kind of facilitating and encouraging my understanding of the world, but also in terms of actually wanting to find out more about different parts of the world as well. And there is a family connection to my interest in South Africa, my research in South Africa, which I can tell you about later on. But also when I went to secondary school, there was a teacher called Mr. Milton, Mr. Edward Milton, and he was unbelievably encouraging. Someone who saw potential, saw a way of kind of sparking my imagination and my kind of well, seeing something in me that might actually lead me to go further into history. And he taught me for 6 of the 7 years that I was at secondary school. And honestly, like he is one of those kind of one of those teachers where I think I'll remember until the day I die because of just how important he was. And after I published my first book, I actually wrote him an email just to say
Oh,
thank you, you're part of this journey, and I just wanted, I wanted to recognize and acknowledge that. So, I mean, in terms of that, though, there was key part of school was like actually, like I was able to do history all the way through, and my family and my parents were like again a really key part of enabling and facilitating my interests and also something that has led into my career. I mean, my mom kind of always said that there was probably no doubt that if I did go to university, that I would study history. The only question is what I would do afterwards. So kind of because that was the academic subjects and the interest that I had, it was then, well, what would I do with it afterwards? What kind of job would I pursue? So I'm very fortunate, very privileged to be able to continue
mm,
to be involved in history and teach history, and perhaps maybe I can inspire some other people to
mm,
want to do similar things.
good. Like any particular event during your time when you're like growing up in especially in the school days as a like teenager, any political event or anything do you think, I mean, also put some kind of light bulb moment for you?
Oh, I mean, at least for kind of the South Africa and interest in African history, I mean, there are two kind of key moments here. Like, I mean, my uncle moved to South Africa in 1995 after apartheid ended. He was employed for 6 years to help with the transformation of the country after apartheid. So he and my aunt moved to Durban in KwaZulu Natal, and I was therefore fortunate enough to go with my family to go out and see my aunt and uncle. And I was 11 years old. This was 1996, so 2 years after apartheid had ended. And we were very fortunate to be able to kind of explore the country, to be able to meet lots of people. And this was also, a moment where South Africa was clearly in a process of change and a process of trying to move beyond kind of the histories of apartheid. I mean, that's a big question if it can ever move beyond the histories of apartheid. But at least there was a lot of optimism in the air in 1996. And also through my dad's work, he knew some people in South Africa, so we met with them. They took us to where they were brought up, and because they were Black South Africans, we were taken to where they grew up in the townships outside of as of Cape Town, a place called Mitchell's Plain. They introduced us to like kind of traditional healers. While in Cape Town in 1996, Robben Island had just stopped being a prison and had been turned into a site of historical memory. So I went out there in 1996. So, I mean, in terms of actually kind of shaping my kind of world view, it was absolutely seminal because I mean,
Mm,
I'm a white kid from Birmingham, and then seeing a very different place. Also, and this sounds perhaps maybe looking back at it from my own positionality now, but actually recognizing my own privilege of living in the UK and actually meeting people who were a lot less fortunate than myself, but also had their lives shaped by race, social injustice, and brutality. So actually, these are really important things. And like, I mean, when you're 11 years old, these are kind of pretty huge
mm,
issues. And I think that's been a kind of a central point in actually kind of trying to shape my own
mm,
actions, my own kind of views, and recognizing that yes, I have my own privileges, but then also what can I do to perhaps help others or help overcome some of the challenges and barriers that might exist. So also around that time, Nelson Mandela had his memoir, the Long Walk to Freedom, published. So I bought a copy of that. And given that I study and have talked about Nelson Mandela, again, getting a book when I was 11, 12 years old about him as a crucial point in actually understanding about that aspect of it. And later on, when I was 17, just before my aunt and uncle left, I went back out again to South Africa and saw different parts of the country. So it was a great opportunity. Again, I appreciate the privilege of being able to go out to South Africa as a teenager and as a child, basically. But the experiences that kind of created, and the kind of interest and intersection with my love of history, I think was really important. History in South Africa at that time really did matter because it shaped everybody's lives. And so to see that kind of in action, in one sense, was pretty remarkable. So yeah, I think in terms of kind of shaping my own political and social values, but also kind of following a trail through towards my interest in South Africa and African history, then that is undeniably part of the story.
I mean, I think you're also very lucky as well from like your family's connections there, and then more or less made you a researcher at the age of 11 of South Africa.
Well, actually, not really in one sense. Like, I mean, yes, the privilege of having that setting and having the opportunity of going, but when I went to university, I was not actually wanting to study African history. I had, through the A levels in England, you're actually focused in on very specific topics, and I must admit I was more interested in kind of European and North American history. So, particularly the USA and the Cold War, and also Weimar Germany and the rise of the Nazis. And one of the reasons why I picked Sheffield University was because Professor Sir Ian Kershaw, who wrote some of the kind of seminal books in the kind of 1990s and early 2000s on the rise of the Nazis, was actually a lecturer at that university. So that was actually the reason why I went to that university. However, after a year at university doing different subjects, thinking about things in a completely new light beyond the kind of exam system, and also because this professor was so well known, he didn't do any teaching. He wasn't there. So that actually, by the time that I would have had the opportunity to have been taught by him, which I think he did a class in my very final year, but by that time I'd moved away, and I'd taken new subjects and had my kind of eyes opened to different kind of ways of thinking about the world through history. And in one sense there is like a sliding doors moment here, because yes, I had the family connections to South Africa, but it could quite easily have been that I went on holiday to South Africa and I saw these places and it was a great experience, but that was it. But in England, you do the 3 years degree rather than 4 up here in Scotland. In my second year, I took a class on decolonization in the 20th century. And that was the moment where it's like, oh, okay, I really enjoy this. And then in your final year, we used to have to do a single subject that went the entire year round. And that was on Zimbabwe and South Africa. And that was the moment where it was like I could then join the dots together. So it would be really simple for me to say, yes, at 11 years old, that like directed me towards my current position. But even so, like actually, if I hadn't picked that module or those 2 modules, then I might be doing something considerably different. I might not even, academia wasn't actually my key aim at leaving university either. So actually, I could have been doing something completely different at that point.
What's you talked about this particular subject area, decolonization and stuff. I mean, any particular professor, lecturer you met for?
Someone called Professor kind of Ian Phimister. He is someone who I'm still in touch with today. He later supervised my PhD when I went back to university. I mentioned my teacher at school, Ed Milton, earlier. So he was a key figure. The next one is Ian Phimister. Again, without him seeing some potential or seeing something within me to encourage me to keep going for the next step, to keep challenging myself, because in all honesty, I didn't think I was good enough to do a PhD. I didn't think I was good enough to go further than that. So he was the kind of person who was like, well, no, you can do the masters. After doing a masters, and then I took a break away from university, he was like, well, you could come back again. You could do this. So he was a major figure in this, and I really liked him. He was so he was born in Zimbabwe. Well, it was actually, by then it was actually called Rhodesia, but he was born in Zimbabwe. He was he fought for social justice. He fought for racial equality, and he got kicked out of Rhodesia for his views. He moved to South Africa, but then he was then part of the struggle. I remember a class in it was our third year, and we were talking about kind of protests and what have you. And he just one day brought in a newspaper front cover, and there was a picture of him leading, as part, the people with arm linked at the front, leading a march through Cape Town. I'm like, geez, this guy has struggle credentials. He was part of. He wasn't using his white privilege in Southern Africa to benefit himself. Clearly he did through being white, but equally he was also struggling for equality in the country. So it's one of those things where you're in a class going, oh wow, you have actually lived through this, you've experienced it, but also been a key part in trying to actually make some changes. So when you have someone teaching you who has that kind of that activity, I think it's very inspiring. So yeah, Ian has been someone who has helped me a lot anyway, and is someone I'm still in touch with, and still try to do work with if possible.
That's quite an interesting story, because my PhD supervisor has got similar kind of idea about me, because I thought I'm shit. so he basically pushed me, even I was very shy person when I came here, and I was quite reluctant to do any kind of teaching as a PhD student. This is just do it.
Now look at you.
now but also his own story is also very inspiring. When I came to Dundee in early 2000, went to his office. So I was in Australia before that. So came to Dundee because my sister lived here throughout her life. So that's part of me coming here. And then went to his office the first day, and the first thing I saw in his office is huge Lenin's picture. I thought, oh my God, this is my man. So he's like Nori McQueen. So Nori McQueen spent almost 10 years in Mozambique in the 70s, the turbulent time. I think he was this teacher there, but he was involved there. So we are talking about, this is the man spent, 10 years in Mozambique those days. This is a huge undertaking. But also I saw him when East Timor, which is my research area, when East Timor became independent. So again, like your uncle, Nori thought that he would contribute to these countries, this nation building. And he went there and spent 6 months there. There's nothing there because Australia destroyed everything. Sorry, Indonesia destroyed everything on the ground. So these are special people. These are special people. I'm still in touch with Nori, but I'm still very shy because with me he's just too big. I cannot be like him. No, he's just amazing, just amazing.
And I think that these inspirational people have huge impact on the people that they meet, the people that they work with, the people they teach, and we are the fortunate ones that we've been able to continue doing the things that we're interested in through the kind of the work and encouragement of people like Nori and myself, Ian.
No, I mean, this is like that. I think the best part of Nori was, I mean, he's the kindest man. So that's the best bit I learned, being
Yeah,
kind,
yeah,
being kind to everyone. And
absolutely.
and I really value this thing. So even my students, I value everyone, with the same weight,
Yeah,
and try my 100% to be kind, to be part of, their struggle as well.
yeah.
And so
I,
that's me. So I think, I mean, that's you as well. And I saw your commitment to your students is just unbelievable.
I could not agree more because, yeah, well, several people have seen potential in me and have encouraged me to be my best
Mm.
and to push myself. And possibly without that, I might not have been where I am. So yeah, and also every person's experience and opportunities are different. So yeah, if you can provide something to help someone else, then absolutely. And those small acts of kindness
Mm.
can actually be huge for those individual people. So yeah, absolutely, I totally agree.
Mm.
And that's the thing when I mean, Ian, he had at one stage I think he had 9 PhD students when I was at Sheffield, and he would I'd send him work or knock on his door, and he'd always have time, always have time. I have no idea how he did any other work, to be fair, but like he always found time or got the comments back really quickly, and that was a huge part of his style of kind of teaching and mentoring, really.
Mm. Mm. These are like, a few good men.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, he was. I mean, 'cause he was I said, like, I mean, academia was something that I was not necessarily interested in doing. I didn't. This was
Mm.
not my career goal, put it that way.
Mm. Mm. And then when you come to the academia with that kind of, background, with those people's, inputs in your lives, that makes your journey also exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mean, just to rewind slightly. I mean, I finished my master's at Sheffield in 2007, and that for me that was it. I'd finished my academic journey.
Mm.
I was I was done. 22 years old, 4 years in university, had a great time, got some fantastic memories, and I was ready to move into the next stage of my life. And the one thing I really wanted to do is I wanted to work for an NGO. I wanted to work for a charity. I wanted to be a researcher, and that was the kind of the path that I was pursuing through my kind of different experiences. Through my university, I volunteered and did all kinds of other bits and pieces. And yeah, so working for an NGO was my key goal. And I did a couple of jobs before I got into the NGO sector. So, and again, I think this is a bit of life advice for other people, is that sometimes the things that you want don't always come immediately, and that there can be some tough times in between. And I mean, I worked for an 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 office equipment company. Essentially, I sold um, computers, table, chairs, and I really didn't enjoy it. I mean, I had to do something to pay the bills and whatnot, but that's what I did. But that then gave me the encouragement to keep on seeking new opportunities and new jobs. And so I did. I was lucky enough to I was down in London for the best part of like 5 months, working for a charity down there called Intelligent Giving, which was a great experience, a great opportunity. I sofa surfed the entire time I lived in London. I had nowhere to live, which, looking back at it, is utterly ridiculous. But at the time, that's what I did. That's what I wanted to do. That's what I put my heart and soul into it. And it was a great opportunity, a great experience. But
Mm.
fortunately, the 2008 recession kicked in, and working for a charity during a recession is not really a great industry to be in,
Mm.
especially when you're reliant on like donor income. So yeah, unfortunately, like the contract wasn't renewed, and so it was then kind of like, what do I do next? Where do I go? And that kind of created some big questions about my future and about the state of the state of the world really at that point. So yeah, some big questions had to be had at that moment, which was then when I began to look towards academia again. Perhaps this sounds terrible in one sense, but my first initial thing was like, well, do a PhD for 3 or 4 years, maybe see out the crisis, and then look for new opportunities within the sector. But once I started my PhD, it was like, no, like if I'm doing this, I need to try and focus on the end goal, and hopefully, I know that there aren't many jobs in academia, so it's like, you have to have a plan A, plan B, plan C, and maybe a plan D. But I was like, if I'm doing a history PhD, then that should be my end goal, but with lots of backups just in case. So yeah, essentially, like, I don't think going into academia it's not a linear path. I mean, it can look like it from my story, saying like beginning in 2011 when I was 11, sorry, going through to now. But there's obviously been some bends in the road, so to speak.
I mean, like, same with me as well. Like, I mean, for me, just having a PhD itself is something. I don't care what will happen after that.
Dr. Youssef for the rest of your life.
Yeah. So like, I mean, so like my PhD supervisor actually at then said, here you go, Dr. Youssef. No, what else you need? And also, like, during my time, so when I was doing my PhDs early 2000, so that's the time when all actually used to work for the call center. So I was part of that call center generation.
Yeah.
Terrible time, like, I mean, daytime is working in the university, and like at night I went to like work for Barclays Bank, back office call center till 11 p.m. Just horrible. I mean, but I mean, that's the story. But also, these stories also, I think, made us that we need to do something meaningful, and then we try to explore that. I mean, what that can be. And so in your case, you try to come back that whether there is something there for you. So, like, I mean, tell us about your the first contact with your PhD supervisor. So you had something in your mind that you wanted this particular person.
So there were 2 parts to the story. One was about where I could get funding to do a PhD, or at least some funding to do a PhD. So I applied to SOAS in London, and I applied to Sheffield. SOAS offered me a place to do a PhD, but couldn't give me any funding at all. Sheffield offered me a place and offered me a fee waiver. So that was the key thing: get the fees paid for. And then I had to do a whole bunch of ridiculous jobs to then pay the bills. But the key thing is I didn't have to pay my fees. So that was the major kind of burden taken off me. But then in terms of Ian, like, he was always the person I wanted to work with, because I said, he was really inspirational, and he had a great knowledge of Southern Africa, and his contact book was utterly ridiculous. Like, I mean, he would be like, I'd be like, I really want to speak to this person. He was like, just thumb through this. Yeah, there we go. Like, there's his email address or phone number or what have you. Because I think a lot of academics during the 70s and 80s were activist academics, often in Southern Africa. So therefore, they were, tightly into these kind of groups and networks of people. So he would just like, oh yeah, here's their number. Name check me, and you'll be fine. The first meeting, though, like, he had this kind of so Sheffield history department used to be in a series of like old houses. It's now a very modern block, but it was a series of old houses. And he essentially had like the front room of this house, and it was huge. It was absolutely it was cavernous, and it was filled with books and papers and what have you. So he had his desk, but you sat in this armchair, beautiful armchair, but obviously it'd been so used and so loved over the years that you sat in it and you just sank into it. So you felt actually quite small. and I'm not a particularly large person anyway. So, and he's a very softly spoken person, and he was just like, you know, what kind of historian do you want to be? That was like his first question. What kind of a historian do you want to be? And that's kind of it's a big question, because that can very much shape your, the way that you approach your sources, the way that you write, even the themes that you're looking at. I don't remember my answer to that, but I remember the question. And then at the end of it, he was like, "Oh, what are your ambitions? What are your goals?" And so I'd actually really like to write a book about Africa. And he was like, "Well, that's a bit of a big undertaking, given that it's a continent of 55 countries." Which is it's a fair point to make. But 3 years ago now, I published a textbook on the African continent, and I actually inscribed a copy to him saying, "Well, we had this meeting. This is what you asked me to do. Well, here is the final the final outcome of it." So that was my kind of the first meeting, the first push towards doing my PhD anyway. But even though I was really driven and I really wanted to get through my PhD, I was a dog sitter, I was a football coach, I was an exam invigilator. Essentially, if there were pounds to be made, I would find a hustle to get me through anyway. And I also wrote to loads of charities as well over the 3 years, and I was really fortunate that a couple of charities, educational charities, kind of gave me some kind of one-off stipends as well, which was very much appreciated and very much needed. So it wasn't as simple a path as it could have been anyway.
Actually didn't know that you were a football coach as well.
When I was at school, I did a sports leaders qualification, which kind of gave me kind of very basic level kind of coaching qualification at the time. And as part of a volunteering initiative at Sheffield University, you could do a bunch of stuff, and I volunteered to help this fella out at a couple of schools who was doing kind of football coaching, and he took me to one side and was like, "Well, would you actually like to do this more regularly?" So for probably about 18 months to 2 years, I was kind of coaching pretty much 6-year-olds to about 14-year-olds around Sheffield, which was great fun. Got to be outside or inside, depending on the location, play football, and again, see people progress as their skills develop. So it was great fun. It didn't really feel like a job, but obviously I was getting paid for it.
Okay, one side question, who is the best football coach at the moment?
The best football coach at the moment? That's a very good question. This will probably alienate some of your viewers as well.
No, that's okay.
So I think in terms of kind of coaching, I think the obvious answers would be Guardiola or Klopp. I mean, they both have very specific ways of looking at the game. They're very driven in how they want their players to implement their philosophies, and also the outcomes have been unbelievably successful. I mean, both Man City and Liverpool over the last kind of 5 years have won pretty much everything, played spectacular football. But also, I think really importantly is that for both teams, under both managers, they coach their players. The players become better. So, for example, at Liverpool, they have a left back called Andy Robertson. He played at Dundee United. I mean, when I first came up to Dundee, I used to go up to, well, I still do, but I went up to Tannadice, and Andy Robertson was playing at Dundee United, and now look at him as a league and Champions League medal winner. So, and he was very good then. He is improved incredibly. So yeah, I mean, that's. I know it sounds really obvious, but those would be the two.
What's your take on, just like 30 seconds, on Mourinho?
He was very good in the 2000s, and he has not adapted or evolved in the way that he possibly should have done. He's not really kept up with things, and his belligerent management style, which is essentially pissing off his players and trying to get them angry, doesn't seem to work anymore. And there's been a pattern in the last kind of 3 or 4 clubs that he comes in, everyone gets excited, then he blames everyone else but himself, and then he eventually leaves. So I mean, he's doing some okay things in Roma in Italy at the moment, but I don't,
So
I think his ship has sailed.
I mean, he's more of a like showman rather than, sometimes I think he prefers that showman more than actual,
Yeah, it feels a lot about him rather than the collective or the team or what have you. So yeah, as you say, the showman aspect thing is quite important.
Okay, so can you touch a bit on your PhD thesis? I mean, if you just like touch quickly.
Yeah, so my thesis was on the foreign policy of the African National Congress, so the ANC. So the main liberation movement in South Africa turned political party, turned government of South Africa. And what I did was I took a political science question and took it into a historical analysis. So basically, quite a lot of the political scientists that discussed South Africa talked about South Africa having an incoherent foreign policy after 1994. And my position, my analysis was like, what are they on about? I mean, because essentially a lot of this literature was like, we're looking at it from 1994 to the present. But I was like, well, foreign policy doesn't just get made like that. There are ebbs, there's flows, there's different pressures on particular people and departments and movements and what have you. So I argued that the African National Congress's foreign policy after apartheid was entirely coherent, but it was based on their long liberation struggle and the ways in which they wished to pursue a position within the world. So often being a defender of the global South, and often standing up for regimes and leaders that were often derided in the West. So people like Gaddafi in Libya, and also like North Korea. So South Africa were like, well, the ANC, were like, these people helped us during our liberation struggle. They helped us achieve our freedom. Therefore, we cannot forget our debt to them. However, the West were like, well, wait, you can't do that. That's not what you're supposed to do. So you had this kind of oscillating foreign policy between trying to fit into kind of global norms, the status quo, but equally having this kind of this balance looking elsewhere. And so basically I was looking at it kind of like almost like a seesaw, like going on how are they trying to work out these two competing paths, but their belief, their adherence towards the global South and other leaders was entirely coherent. Like that was actually a coherent policy. So that was kind of what I did. So I basically charted from 1960 as the ANC went into exile through until the early Thabo Mbeki government in the 2000s. So that was the kind of the stretch, and kind of answering a couple of questions which want to show the kind of historical connections between them.
Like, I mean, in terms of your primary research, like what kind of like archive stuff you actually looked for?
So yeah, I mean, so being a historian, obviously the primary sources, and I did interviews as well, but I mean the primary sources are a key aspect. So there were two elements to this. The first was using the documents here in the UK, so particularly at the Bodleian Library in Oxford and the National Archives in London. Now, this tells you actually a lot about colonialism and the legacies of empire, given that huge quantities of South Africa's documents are here in the UK, but that's a different debate and a different story. But I then was using several archives. So there's the Liberation Archive at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa. It's a very remote university campus designed specifically by the apartheid state to be as far away from anything as possible. But the ANC and other liberation movements donated sections of their archive to there. So I was there for about, I went there twice during my PhD. So I probably spent about 5 weeks there in total, maybe. I also used the Mayobuye archives in Cape Town, and the William Cullen papers also so the William Cullen Library, in Cape Town as well. Unfortunately, that burnt down recently. And then I used the historical papers and the South African historical archives in Johannesburg. And I also was able to use the what was then called the Department of Foreign Affairs archives, which were in Pretoria. So I was able to kind of patch a narrative together around the different sources in different places. A key problem, though, for me was because of a lot of archival restrictions. You have usually a 20-year rule that the stuff that I was looking at, particularly in the 1990s, was often embargoed because it hadn't reached the 20-year limit yet. And so that involved a bit more maneuverability. I had to I chatted to people who, a lot of them had their own personal archives. And I was very, very fortunate that I bumped into a former Department of Foreign Affairs official who was just like one day going, yeah, just come around my house and photograph my filing cabinet. So I did, and there was huge quantities of documents that if I hadn't have met him, then actually my arguments and a key part of my thesis probably wouldn't have worked actually. So, again, there's serendipity and a lot of luck that comes into some of these things. But those are the kind of key documents. So there's documents from the ANC, there was documents from the Department of Foreign Affairs, there was documents through the transition process that I was looking at. So it was a huge quantity of very different pieces as I tried to essentially thread them together to create some sort of coherent assessment and analysis of the ANC and later South African foreign policy.
Well, that's an amazing story. I mean, the luck and everything, and also I think your sheer commitment as well. You really want to do something special here. Yeah. I mean, just to add another different story to this. I mean, at Fort Hare, I was staying at a place called Hogsback, which is one of the nearest kind of places which has a series of hostels and B&Bs and whatnot. It's 50 minutes away up a mountain, and I didn't have a car. So the people there must have thought I was absolutely ridiculous. But I turned up, and they put out a message around the village going, is anyone driving to the university each morning? And if anyone's driving back in the afternoon, can you take him back? So the first time I was down there, essentially this village looked after me as people drove me to the university, people drove me back, and I was kind of actually welcomed into their community. But again, looking back at it, it's utterly mad what I did. But then again, I didn't have the opportunity to hire a car at the time, so I hadn't really put these two and two together. And but it actually meant that I met lots of very nice people who took me under their wing and looked out for me and supported me. So I will forever owe a debt of gratitude to them for helping me be able to do that. But it was one of those things where you get a range of experiences and a range of opportunities in different parts of South Africa. So you see the range and differences of the country. Because I mean it's enormous, and this province has its own own kind of pulse. So it was great to see those and experience a whole range of different materials and peoples as well. So I really want to, because I myself is a political scientist, so-called political scientist. because like foreign policy, because I teach Middle East politics, and foreign policy is a big part, like how this, the problem with the foreign policy is part of it, because that's as if you take like realist views of the foreign policy, it's always pragmatic and self-interest, national interest, and all those things. And then states care about those things. States are pragmatic, rational actors. So it's quite difficult for South Africa coming out from apartheid and all those serious historical trauma, and then deal with the world, which is pragmatic, self-interested, and the big players are actually into that game big way. Did you struggle? Like, I mean, what's going on here? Some emotional conundrum.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, this was one of the big questions for the PhD and also for South Africa more broadly. On the one hand, they desperately needed investment and money to make South Africa a better place, to transform it. I mean, the apartheid state was bankrupt. It was bankrupt due to isolation and to the sanctions against it. And it's a clear demonstration that sanctions can work. But then the investment largely came from Western sources. Yet at exactly the same time, there was an anti-imperialist rhetoric. So how do you square that circle between anti-imperialism on the one hand, and often very public anti-imperialism from the ANC, and on the other hand going, please give us huge amounts of investment and trade deals. So that was problematic. There was also that the end of the Cold War, when South Africa gets its freedom, means that alternative models of economic policy have essentially been discredited by the West at this point in time. So therefore, there is no alternative. It's neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus. And yes, things are beginning to change, but at least at that point in the 1990s, there was no alternative. So there was that aspect. But then also various other Southern African nations, particularly places like Mozambique, Zambia, Angola, had supported the ANC in exile for pretty much like 30 years. And they were like, well, okay, what's our reward for this? And then South Africa, well, actually, no, we need to transform ourselves. We can't help you now. And so there were these questions about actually, how do you prioritize? How do you, navigate these different pressures? And this is why, kind of said earlier, it was like the kind of seesaw, like how on earth do you actually balance out the different components to your foreign policy? So yeah, it was a very, it's obviously very challenging for South Africa, and very, it's why they were described as having an incoherent foreign policy. But at least at the period that I was looking at anyway, there was coherence. It's changed now, but at least before, there was coherence.
Because like one of the key things, because you are, historian, like try to like compare contrast, like just like for the lay audience, like this like apartheid and post-apartheid. I mean, what's the difference? What kind of difference we're talking about here? How big the difference is?
It's fundamental, really. I mean, so apartheid was established in 1948. It was a system of governance and legislation which was entirely premised on race. It organized every aspect of political, social, and economic life in South Africa based on the color of your skin. And it either created or denied opportunities. And the system was enforced through violence and brutality by the state. And it was all-encompassing. So this system, which also has its roots in British colonialism, I should say, like this is a much longer history of this form of segregation than what the formal start of apartheid in 48. But it meant that South African society was very much shaped around these core components of segregation and division. And therefore, in 1994, when the ANC under Mandela and the ANC, are elected, how do you change those things? Now, clearly, in South Africa, at least in kind of in theory and legislation, you will not be discriminated upon the color of your skin. But privilege perpetuates, privilege maintains itself, and wherever you look in the world, that happens. But in South Africa, this is a generalization, but by and large, the white population of South Africa remain extremely wealthy and extremely privileged because of the connections and because of the benefits of apartheid. Now, I appreciate that lots of people have been born after 1994. They were not part of the apartheid state, but they still have those privileges that link way beyond 1994. So these are the kind of things that, so yes, the country has changed incredibly in one sense, but also and very much formally. But in terms of kind of some of the long-lasting legacies, then they still perpetuate. But there have also been mistakes along the way as well by the ANC, who could and possibly should have done things differently to enable greater transformation. And these are questions that are being discussed in South Africa at this moment in time. So yeah, I mean, for your listeners, apartheid and post-apartheid are obviously radically different forms of governance. And since 1994, democracy, human rights, dignity, being being put forward anyway, at least. Whereas before, those were everything you did was premised on the color of your skin.
I mean, I myself is not expert on South Africa and all those things, but a couple of political events, still I remember. So this South Africa's this special, I think that's a referendum, isn't it? In 1994, then the white people were asked that, do you want?
Oh, so that was in 1992.
1992. Can you give us some more idea? So the white people are deciding that, that whether they want to continue this rule or not.
So by so just to give you a bit more context, so by the end of the 1980s, apartheid was increasingly unviable. The protests and the sanctions and just the all-round isolation of South Africa was kind of reaching its crux. You also have the massive amounts of resistance and unrest within South Africa as the liberation movements and the trade unions challenge the hegemony of the apartheid state. And then the Cold War begins to crumble as well. So the apartheid government, the white minority, is increasingly under threat at this point. In February 1990, F.W. de Klerk releases Mandela and the ANC to begin the process of negotiations. Now, I'm sure as many of your listeners and yourself will realize is that anyone who enters negotiations wants to win, especially if they're the ones initiating it. So should make it really clear is that the National Party thought that by beginning the negotiations that they would win, or at least they would come out with a system of governance that was beneficial to them. Against this backdrop in South Africa, the loosening of political restrictions and different political parties, different ideologies vying for position leads to enormous amounts of violence. Between 1990 and 1994, more people are killed through political violence than at any other point in that modern section of South African history. Now, I should say that the government does stoke quite a lot of this. So, that is part of this kind of matrix. And as the negotiations are beginning to unfold, there is a pushback from parts of the conservative white population who are like, we don't want this. We want segregation to continue. We want division to continue. And so de Klerk goes out to the South African people, the white South African people, I should say, and asks them, do we want to continue with this or not? And the referendum is, it's a positive message for further negotiations, because the backdrop of the instability in South Africa was mounting, but also the rest of the world was like, this this form of governance is no longer acceptable. I mean, it was no longer acceptable when it was implemented, but now in 1982 at this point, it's absolutely not acceptable. So there was huge pressure on that white population there. But also, unlike decolonization elsewhere around the African continent, is that a significant section of the white population of South Africa have their roots from 1652. Like, they've been on the African continent for hundreds of years. And so, unlike, say, like Ghana or Nigeria, where, the British population just go back to Britain, is that this population has nowhere to go. So negotiations become increasingly more important about actually how they secure their interests. So yeah, this is a big moment in South African history, because if they said no, then who knows what would have happened. But the pattern that was emerging in South Africa at that time was one of essentially a low-level civil war, which would have probably continued anyway. So it was this was a big moment to pushing negotiations further. But I mean, just to kind of complete that story, is that the National Party end up pretty much giving up most of their demands through the negotiations. They enter the negotiations thinking that they had a position of power, and actually, by the end of it, lost a lot of political power. They didn't really lose economic power, though. That's the big difference. But in terms of political opportunity, they thought that they would get more out of it, and they didn't really.
Like, I mean, I read quite a lot, especially in the people like Edward Said and post-colonial theory and all those things. I mean, it's quite astounding to see in like South Africa, So even at that moment, they also wanted to control that, how to deliver this. I mean, as if it's their duty to deliver even post-apartheid South Africa.
Sure.
So if you talk about even like the slavery did not stop because of the House of Lords and bunch of ruling class decided that we need to give them some. It's the slave themselves. Their rebellion, their resistance actually made that possible. So that's the key thing. So I mean, this so-called referendum, I mean, it still like shows the power, the grip of the powerful.
And I think also that there was because pretty much the entire future of what South Africa would look like was at stake at this moment in time. So therefore, there are huge debates about what forms of governance there should be. Should there be a federalist or a unitary state? What should be the voting model? There were huge, fundamental questions about what the country would look like. And the transition kind of really dealt with the political aspect. And one of the debates in South Africa now is about this idea of an elite pact, that essentially the leaders of the ANC and the leaders of the National Party essentially got together and sorted out something that worked for both of them. So, fundamental questions such as land redistribution, which is a key question in South Africa, or who had control of particular levers of the economy, also came into question. I mean, the ANC really stridently in the early 1990s pushed a position of nationalization and then stepped back from it. And part of this is to do with the context of the 1990s. But essentially, economics wasn't really dealt with at this moment in time, which means that even the bits that have changed, and things have changed, I should get that, I should make it very clear. There is a growing black middle class. There is obviously some very wealthy black South Africans too. Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, is one of them. But the change in politics doesn't necessarily change the economic structure. And this is becoming abundantly clear in South Africa. And it means also that the inequalities that were enshrined under apartheid haven't really been overcome because you have wealth within the elite, and that elite can, it doesn't matter the color of their skin, it's just about wealth, but it still creates division and inequality in South Africa. I mean, the Gini coefficient in South Africa is outrageous. I mean, it's the most unequal place in the world, which then brings into question how much has been changed. What are the transformations? I'm generally a very positive person, and I like to hope that things will continue to transform, and I see it in different ways when I'm there. But also, it is abundantly clear that lots of things have not changed.
I mean, especially, I mean, some of the statistics are just frightening. I think white minorities like just 13% of the population, but they control, I think, 73 to 74% of the land. So we are talking about these are the land where you can, grow stuff. And then, like 75% people are actually Black, and then the rest belongs to them. That's quite dysfunctional. So when you talk about the post-colonial world, if you think about, so the post-colonial came by dismantling the whole old system. But in terms of in the South Africa's political, this history and modern history, it looks like the structure is still there very much.
But in many places across the African continent, though, actually, the post-colonial structures actually weren't that different from the inheritance of the colonial state. So in one regard, actually, that things weren't revolutionary change. South Africa didn't change because of a revolutionary overthrow. It changed because of negotiation, and negotiations themselves are not necessarily revolutionary. Frantz Fanon talked about the need to essentially wipe the slate clean, but he argued that if there was, a remnant of kind of the national bourgeoisie, that things would just continue as they did before, and in many settings that did. And so, in South Africa, as I said, lots of questions and lots of issues were left because they were too big to be dealt with. Get the political change first, and hopefully you can change other things afterwards. But it's also the reason why you had the Rhodes Must Fall campaigns in 2015, 2016, because clearly education and kind of issues of representation in South Africa hadn't been dealt with, and the youth of the country were kind of questioning why certain things had stayed the same. And connected to that, and your comment you just made a moment ago, is that if you look at the youth unemployment statistics in South Africa, I mean, they are genuinely terrifying. Essentially 50% of everyone under 25, even if they've got a degree or not, are unemployed. So it's storing, it's storing problems up for the future. I mean, there's problems right now, and huge problems right now, but it stores problems up for the future as well. And these are things that haven't been fully addressed, or there is no real plan on how to actually change those things. And part of this is to do with global economics, and about how you actually create jobs and create opportunity too.
Because you have been to South Africa lots of times. In terms of the physical structure of the country, I mean, how segregated is still, in terms of the gated community and all those things. I mean, how much visible those things are when you go to South Africa?
I think anyone who sets foot in South Africa would notice it pretty much immediately. The physical urban infrastructure of South Africa was created to divide. So, look at for example, look at the roadmap of Cape Town. Look at the angle of the main roads into the city centre, and you can see that the road itself is a barrier to mobility, but also a barrier between communities as well. So those things are very difficult to change. So your viewers should look at the map of Cape Town to see those things. There's one that motorway runs down the side, and then like two that come into the city centre, and the city centre's up here. So segregation is there. In certain parts of the country, you'll pretty much only see white people, and the people who are doing, who might be your kind of waiter in a restaurant will almost all be black. The because of the inequality in South Africa, wealth then hides itself in these gated communities, and pretty much, significant sections of South African society live in gated communities with private security guards and electric fences, whereas those that are marginalized and have not been given economic opportunity are living in either in the townships, which are not often, they're at the edge of the city, again designed specifically to keep away from what were deemed white areas, and those, for example, like Soweto in Johannesburg, has a population of like over 1 million people. It's massive, but it takes about half an hour to an hour to get from Soweto to central Johannesburg. So you have marginalization, you have segregation there. So yes, it's very visible. It'd be very hard not to spot it if you turned up, unless you wanted to physically turn a blind eye to it. So yeah, it's still a divided society.
What do you think the future? Do you think it looks like it's a long haul, isn't it? Or this is just a permanent feature forever for South Africa?
So I think, unfortunately, South Africa mirrors many places around the world, where economic inequality shapes the pattern of societal change. Brazil is often one of the places that is compared most to South Africa in terms not only of its economic background, but also its racial background and racial segregation too. I think the major thing that has to happen is that there needs to be a change of government in South Africa. The ANC have been in power since 1994, and there doesn't seem to be a plan being put forward about what they're going to do. And that's a key thing, is that the power of incumbency, or the status of incumbency, kind of comes back to bite. They haven't really been challenged too much because there aren't many other political parties, and there are lots of political parties, but not in a position to actually challenge the ANC, at least on a national basis. And so there are accusations that the ANC essentially looks after itself rather than South Africa. And so that would need to be the big thing. I'm a historian. I'm not a fortune teller. So I can't really say what exactly the future would be. But I think the major thing has to be about change of government with new ideas, and to try and set in motion other things. But essentially, South Africa has said it's beginning to mirror many other places around the world. But, and I think this is the big but, is that the historical legacies of apartheid still continue to affect the country to this day, both on race, segregation, educational and economic opportunity.
And the problem is, you cannot build your nation without resolving those historical problem areas.
Yeah. So at the moment, there is a discussion about land, and there is a big debate about whether land should now just be confiscated without compensation. That there is a genuine discussion about that. But then this then brings in kind of slightly thorny issues, because, for example, in KwaZulu-Natal, the largest landowner is the Zulu king, who is black. So therefore, does his land get redistributed? And so these are theoretical and also practical problems that need addressing. And I think each time they get raised, there's too many problems, too many challenges, that it just gets kicked further down the line. But the longer it gets kicked down the line, then the less that gets done and the things get worse. So yeah, but yeah,
that makes sense. I mean, it's quite. I mean, like for me, like if a country like my country, Bangladesh, I was born in Bangladesh. I mean, if you look at the colonial history and the subsequent history, it's just not easy for kind of bounce back to become a stable country, because the trauma is so much for 300 years, trauma, the destruction and all those things. So I really want to give benefit of doubt to ANC and other groups of people, because it's tough. It's tough on the ground.
Absolutely. But I couldn't agree more with you, actually. I mean, in terms of the long-lasting historical impact, also the structure of economic and political global power has a big part of this as well, and especially for nations in the so-called global South, that they're the ones that that are at the bottom of this hierarchy and are continue to be impacted by these things, which are clearly connected to colonial legacies and impact. I think it's just that in South Africa, many of the aspirations, many of the dreams that could have been implemented possibly haven't been done so. And it doesn't necessarily help that former President Jacob Zuma, is going through the courts as we speak, connected to corruption charges. So there is a feeling amongst some sections of the population that the opportunities have been squandered. Now, I don't necessarily think that everything could have been changed. No, and this is where I totally agree with your point there. But there are other places and moments where the ANC could have done things differently, and that has not necessarily been for the benefit of all South Africans.
Like, I mean, two of the major characters I really want to bring, because I think I'm aware of our time as well. Like Mandela and Stephen Biko. I mean, these are the two people I really, and these are important people. I mean, can you give us some idea about their lives and their like legacies? I mean, how important they are?
I mean, Nelson Mandela is one of those kind of global figureheads that has both symbolic power and also very real and practical influence. So, here is a person who kind of led an aspect of the ANC's liberation struggle. He went to prison because he was a leader of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the guerrilla arm of the ANC, which is often people forget that he was part of that. But in prison, he moved towards a position of kind of reconciliation. He moved towards the thing that actually, if you keep on fearing and antagonizing other people, then you just get stuck in a cycle of violence. And so he believed in this idea of non-racialism in South Africa, and he really wanted to draw people together. And his efforts to get forgiveness and reconciliation was absolutely vital in the 1990s. I mean, he actually brought he was able to bring warring sides together, and actually his moral authority, his values really kind of helped South Africa at that point. And also his views, I think, also helped draw in other nations around the world who were skeptical about the ANC and its liberation struggle. So he was very, very important. And, I mean, we kind of mentioned it in the intro very briefly, but Dundee gave him the freedom of the city in 1985. And this is huge. I mean, a small East Coast city in Scotland, 6,000 miles away from South Africa, gives a political prisoner the freedom of the city. So I think it shows you the standing that he had. And he was crucial in the 1990s, particularly drawing people together. But that would also forget that he has if you took that stance, forget that he had an enormous and varied history. He was a lawyer. He was a member of the ANC Youth League. He was a member of the Defiance campaigns in the 1950s, and led a section of the Umkhonto we Sizwe, and then went to jail for 27 years. So huge huge part of South African history, and also one that has been adopted by many people around the world. For many Western people, and many white people in particular, is that Nelson Mandela is often upheld as being like a saint or someone who he kind of could walk on water. But again, in South Africa at the moment, there is actually a debate about his legacy, his impact, about actually what he stood for, and actually about whether, even though his values of reconciliation were really important, actually were they too forgiving to a population that had enacted brutality and oppression. So there is an ongoing debate about the legacy of Mandela, which for some people in the West might really surprise them to hear that. For Steve Biko, I mean, Steve Biko for me I think he's one of the greatest South African thinkers. Black consciousness is such an amazing kind of in terms of philosophy and ideas, about freeing your mind from the oppression of colonialism. Free your mind first before you can achieve political and economic freedoms. And in many ways, his ideas through Black consciousness were more challenging to the apartheid state than anything that had come before it, because if you can free yourself of mental oppression, i.e. that why are you doing these things to your oppressors, then actually you can challenge the state in many ways. And also, because it's an idea, it doesn't necessarily have to be associated to Black consciousness. Just because you as an individual go, I'm actually now challenging the apartheid state. You don't have to be an advocate of Black consciousness, but that idea has still kind of got the ball moving, so to speak. And so, especially amongst the kind of student movement in the 1970s, as the ANC was kind of in the doldrums in many ways, in exile, the Black consciousness movement was a key political force in the 1970s. But it wasn't necessarily a political movement that was forced. It was the idea that it was shedding yourself of the fear of the oppressive state. Because then once you lose your fear of apartheid, what else can they take? If you're willing to put yourself forward to protest against the apartheid state, well, what can they do? There's nothing left for them to take from you. So Black consciousness was vital, and it's also a reason why Steve Biko was given an internal banning order in South Africa and later murdered by the apartheid state. They feared his ideas. They feared what he could inspire amongst the Black population of South Africa. Hence the way in which they treated him. Perhaps, unfortunately, in the present day, again, it's beginning to change, but Black consciousness and Steve Biko aren't readily remembered. Part of this is to do with the ANC monopolizing liberation and struggle history in South Africa, and Steve Biko was not part of the ANC. But there is a growing kind of reevaluation or a turn back towards Black consciousness ideals, especially given the lack of transformation in various parts of South Africa. So I think that in the present, it's beginning to change, and there's a growing reevaluation of Steve Biko himself, even though he might not be as prominently displayed as someone like Nelson Mandela in South Africa. So yeah, I mean, both people are absolutely fundamental, and Steve Biko is great, and can't be he's just he's a key part of South Africa's history anyway.
No, I was just listening a couple of things last night about this South Africa's students movement about Rhodes Must Fall, and I can see their views about this Black consciousness and being Black and proud. I kind of sense that that's Biko there more than actually Nelson Mandela, and perhaps the South Africa's ultimate breakthrough will come through this young generation.
I mean, it's always the saying is that the hope of any society is they're young, but yes, this was the group or groups of people who were questioning and challenging their material and intellectual position in South Africa. You know, the Rhodes statue sat in the middle of the University of Cape Town. You know, as you walk up the steps that go up the halfway up the mountain to get to the university, Rhodes was looking out across the Cape Flats, and for for every black student that walks past it, this is a person who not only created enormous amounts of pain in South Africa, but also had a nation named after himself in Rhodesia. So there was that question about why is that here? What does this statue symbolize? Now it's not necessarily about the statue, and that's another debate that we're having here in the UK anyway. But it's about what that represents in South Africa at that point, and about why in a majority black population that someone who had created so much pain and anguish and also benefited from the exploitation of those populations as well would still be commemorated in that way. And so it got people thinking differently. It was like, well yes, why are we studying the subjects that we're doing, or why is the state of South Africa the way it is? Which then brought up questions about, as I mentioned a moment ago, about Nelson Mandela, about what he stood for, about his role in the negotiations and what have you. So but that's where I think black consciousness and Steve Biko's ideas are beginning to come back to the forefront anyway, or at least maybe not to the forefront, but they're back in the conversation anyway.
I'm quite involved in this kind of politics as well, what a blind spot that is, isn't it? Post-apartheid Africa, South Africa, and you have got this huge statue of Rhodes, it just mind-boggling.
But across the country, those remnants still exist. Pretty much next door to the University of Cape Town is the Rhodes Monument. So there's still a monument to Cecil Rhodes next door to the university. In Cape Town, there is still Verwoerd Drive. He was described as the architect of apartheid, but there is still a major road named after Verwoerd. So again, these things are changing, I should say. Things are changing. But it shows you that there were many questions and many issues that needed solving, or at least challenging, in the 1990s. But there were just so many of them that many of them just got left to one side.
I think these things like Rhodes and these people are actually antithesis of what we are talking about here: the black consciousness, the emancipation of the people, of the humanity. And then the symbols just stay around, just there. So I think that consciousness has to be there to get the things done.
I see, but then also if you're economically marginalized in a country where essentially you're fighting for survival, then actually some of these bigger ideas get put to one side, because your day-to-day reality is even though some of these things are clearly connected, is that you focus on your here and there, rather than necessarily focusing on some maybe the symbols of apartheid leaders or what have you.
So I'll take just another 5-10 minutes. Will that be okay?
That's fine.
Yeah. So can you tell us about your current research? What's the most exciting thing you're doing at the moment?
Due to the pandemic, I had to change some of my ideas and the way in which I could research, because the inability to move beyond kind of Scotland has obviously impacted on the things that I can do. So one thing that this was also kind of in motion before 2018. We're talking about 2018. We actually started about 2018. Actually, started to focus on Mandela's links to Dundee. And it started with a former PhD student and a good friend and colleague now, Dr. Chris Fever, who now works at the University of the Free State in South Africa. Yeah, he's a postdoc there. Yeah, so yeah, it's great.
He's my former student as well.
Yeah. I taught him as an undergrad in, I think it's my second year as a lecturer here. So yeah, he was an undergraduate at the time, and it's nice to seen him flourish since that point. But we put on like an exhibition about the city's links to Mandela, and it should, fingers crossed, be coming out in April and May of this year, which will be in the Central Library in Dundee. So the one thing we started to look at, because of the inability to travel, was the Anti-Apartheid Movement in the UK. There's still a link to South Africa, linked to the liberation struggle, but looking at how the British social movement kind of helped, or at least provided assistance to the struggle. So we wrote an article that came out last autumn on the 1990s. So as apartheid and the negotiations kicked it, apartheid ended, negotiations kicked in, how this social movement dealt with that question. And we're now looking into doing a project on kind of regional and city groups across the UK. So, there were 187 local anti-apartheid groups across the UK. Dundee had one, Aberdeen, Glasgow, Edinburgh, what have you. And looking at how and why kind of people joined the anti-apartheid struggle, how the movement influenced or was influenced by its regional setting. So, I mean, Dundee was quite a strong leftist trade unionist city, particularly in the 1980s, and how that impacted on mobilization and activity. And we want to try and tell the story from a different angle, because most of the history of the anti-apartheid movement is from its kind of central base, which is in London, and its national campaigns. And these national campaigns, such as the Free Nelson Mandela or the sports boycotts or whatever, were very high profile aspects in isolating the apartheid state. But we want to tell the stories of these regional groups, because individuals often gave up enormous amounts of time to be part of the struggle. It might be a picketing, a supermarket in central Dundee or something like that. But we want to tell those stories. And thankfully, in one sense, because of the way the pandemic, panned out, is that everyone learned how to use Zoom. And so we did, over like the last year or two, we've done, I think, about 25 interviews over Zoom with people from lots of different parts of the UK, with different experiences, different stories to tell, and they played a big part of our research. So we've been very lucky in building a network of former activists, and then trying to piece together again their stories, both from a local perspective into a more national one. So it's still South Africa, it's still connected to the liberation struggle, but the pandemic kind of forced a reevaluation, or at least a rejig, and at least what I'm doing in the next kind of 2 to 3 years, just to the lack of mobility.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant stuff. I mean, so well done.
Thank you.
I think to me, like, this is part of the project. Unless everyone is free, we are not free. I mean, everyone has to be free. It looks like there are billions of people still not free, and with this pandemic, it more exposed, how unfree we are. 2 more questions. One question is, what would be your advice for future students who are coming to study history? I mean, what it takes to become a top historian?
To be critical of the world around them, not like in essentially like not criticizing for the sake of criticizing, but be critical about the way things are the way they are today. Think about how things got to this stage. What were the structures? What were the changes? What were the stages that got to that point? They need to be analytical. We need to be able to kind of think about their sources and the materials to build constructive arguments. You can't just criticize something without actually having the evidence and the analysis to make a strong position, a strong case on that. I mean, the key thing is to read. I mean, I know that we have multiple pressures on our time. I know that, and there's always a distraction, be it from social media to kind of the never-ending news cycle. But to read and to read widely, because that gives you a sense of different parts of the world. You know, I'm interested in South Africa, obviously, and that's where most of my reading goes. But equally, finding out about things that are happening in Latin America or in Southeast Asia, or what have you. You know, these things are connected. There are parallels. There are sometimes comparators, and being aware that things don't happen in a silo. Things don't happen. You know, you might be really interested in, say, Scottish history. That's great. That's really important. But equally, Scottish history is impacted by other competing vectors, which, you know, if you need to recognise those to see the kind of the ebbs and the flows. So yeah, I think it's being critical, it's being analytical, it's thinking about the sources that you have, but also about you know, being able to kind of have a bigger picture of the world. That's the key thing. That's what we want to be able to do.
Like, apart from like reading your books, what other books you recommend to the future students?
I think it would always depend on the subject that they're picking. I mean, that is obviously because you know, that will obviously shape why they're reading it and for what purpose. But I mean, Said's Orientalism. I mean, I would highly recommend reading that. I mean, obviously, I think the work of Frantz Fanon as well is fascinating. I can see why it gets praised. I can also see why it gets criticized too. But I think Frantz Fanon is a really good way of thinking about kind of the ways in which the world is the way it is. And he made some very pertinent points at the time. And even, like, you know, read some Steve Biko. And if you want a more accessible thing, read Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom. I mean, there we go. I mean, there is a story about perseverance, about values, about justice, and also about the oppressions that he faced, and the people of South Africa faced too. So there's a range of things for you to think about.
Like, one very last question, because I mean, one of the particular thing I really want to cover, like how pandemic, you know, affects our lives. Since almost we are heading for like year 3 now. Can you give us some of your understanding about the whole thing?
I mean, it's both. Well, it's frightening. It's uncertain, I think, is key, and I think also has taken us out of what we expected before. Life just, you know, seemed to be hurtling past a frightening rate anyway. And, you know, up until kind of early 2020, you know, my life at that time seemed to be on permanent fast forward. So then suddenly, like, to have things pretty much kind of not, I mean, they haven't stopped at all. They've actually probably got busier, but in different ways. But like, in terms of the actual pandemic, I think that one thing that I personally have learned is resilience. I mean, I've found it enormously difficult, you know, in terms of isolation from, you know, other people, from, you know, family and friends who are, you know, scattered across the world. You know, those things, you know, been hard and been tough. It's taken a while to kind of adjust to, you know, doing what we're doing now, like talking over Zoom, and you know, the Zoom fatigue, and it, you know, is real. Like, you know, being online essentially permanently is a big part of what we do now. And I think, you know, sometimes I don't feel entirely comfortable with that. I mean, I understand the benefits of it enormously, but also it can be quite challenging too. And I think it's just another big thing, though, is also been focusing on the individual, on myself. Like, I mean, you mentioned, you know, before we came on air about this, you know, about you helping to bring other people together and about talking and what have you. And I think actually, taking more time away, even though I said work has got busier, which it has, but it's also being willing to step back as well and actually say, like, no, I'm not doing that, or I can't do it. I think it's been a big, big part of it, and about reevaluating perhaps what are the important things in life personally. So, I think those are the things that the pandemic has really driven. I mean, clearly in the ways in which we work and engage with one another, I mean, those have transformed our lives pretty, in more ways than one. And I think we're still seeing, we're still working through them, really. But it's also, as you mentioned as well earlier in the conversation, is that it has uncovered the enormous differences, not only within the UK but also around the world. And there are sliding scales of privilege. And I've kept my job, which is great. Lots of people didn't get that, but then I don't live in a place which has a separate study, so I work and live in the same space, which is not really a great situation. But then other people would have had huge families together trying to do exactly the same thing. So I think it's clearly uncovered the challenges in our society, the enormous differences that there are, and our lived realities and our lived experiences of the pandemic have been very, very different from one another. There were restrictions, but clearly those have shaped and marked people in very, very different ways. So, on the one hand, it's been enormously tough, but equally, I appreciate and acknowledge my own privilege as well, in terms of keeping a roof over my head and maintaining my job and those kind of things. So, it's been a very, very odd few years, but it's also losing the things that you like doing. I like going to the football. I like doing sport with other people. I like going out with my friends, or I like being able to try and travel or experience new places. And those are the things that were inhibited by it. But then I think also then it might be about how you readjust to those, or change your mindset. Actually, I mean, sometimes I think it can possibly be quite bad to dwell on the things that I cannot have. I really want to go and watch some live music, but I can't go and watch some live music. So why should I? I shouldn't get down about it because I can't physically go and do it. So those are some of the things that I think that I have anyway experienced.
But I think one thing for sure is, I mean, we need lots of kindness around us, and that's really important.
So everyone's experiences have been shaped in different ways, and none of us know what other people's lives have been like. So until we ask, or until we understand why certain things have happened, then those are the things that have to be around. So kindness is a crucial part of this.
Matt Graham, very good man.
Absolutely.
So I mean, no, we really enjoyed this whole talk, but also this is not the last time you're coming. You have to come back again.
I've got more stories to tell you.
Yeah, lots of the stories. But I mean, we had this like fascinating things we had today from you. So I mean, hopefully, for our whoever it is, get something from this. Even like small thing can change their thought process, or any kind of understanding about the world we're going through right now will be amazing. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I can't agree with more of you. Like,
I'm really happy for this session. Thank you.
Great stuff. Nice one. See you soon.
Okay. Good man.
Bye.
Bye.